Well, 1 year ago today, at this hour, market futures were plunging as the U.S. awoke to an increasingly unnerving reality. The coronavirus had been here for weeks. The scope of the outbreak, though, was just becoming clear. I want to bring in Cheddar's senior editor and my co-host of the Need to Know podcast, Carlo, as I sit here from an empty studio, the only one quite literally on this floor right now. It has been quite a year. Yesterday, we looked back on this full week of last year, but let's drill down on this day. If you could walk us through last March 11th, if you could.
Yeah, Jill, March 11th, 2020. I think it's a date that's probably going to go down in this country's history. You know, you and I had just finished our daily podcast. I was there in the studio with you. The big story of the morning, President Biden, he was at that point a candidate, but he had just won the Michigan primary the night before, putting him on a glide path to win the Democratic nomination. Take a look at the New York Times front page from a year ago today. Now, none of this is to say that the coronavirus wasn't out there. It was top of mind for all of us. You and I, for instance, had been talking about it at that point, really ever since the first cases of this mysterious new virus started appearing in Wuhan, China, back around the first of the year. But over the course of the next several hours, it had become clear, if it hadn't been already, we were looking at a generational news event unfolding in real time. The number of COVID cases in the U.S. crossed 1,000 that morning, up tenfold from the week earlier. 29 Americans had died. The stock market had been all over the place for days, the big swings in both directions. And then the opening bell rang on Wall Street. The Dow dropped 800 points immediately. The VIX, which is the gauge that looks at fear in the market, that jumped from 40 to 60. Take a look at our coverage from that morning.
Now the Dow down almost 1,000 points, about 980 points at this point in time, down about 4%. The Russell 2000 down 4%. Those small cap names, also the S&P 500 down 3.5%.
That brings us to about 10 a.m. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease doctor, he was still a relatively unknown face to the American public at that point. He testifies to the House that this coronavirus thing is real and that the worst is yet to come.
I can say we will see more cases and things will get worse than they are right now.
Now, Fauci actually has to cut that hearing short because he's been summoned to the White House for an emergency meeting. Meanwhile, in the noon Eastern hour, halfway around the world in Geneva, Switzerland, the World Health Organization drops an absolute bomb.
All right, we do have some breaking news we want to get to. The World Health Organization has now declared the coronavirus outbreak a global pandemic.
That brings us to about midway through the day here on the East Coast. The Dow is in free fall. It will end up closing down 1,500 points. And with that, the longest economic expansion in American history has officially come to an end. 4 p.m. Eastern Time, the closing bell rings on Wall Street. The U.S. officially enters a bear market. Then, Jill, over the course of the late afternoon and evening, several cultural events happen in rapid succession that really signal to Americans who maybe weren't paying attention to the market or the WHO that day that this is indeed the real deal. So first, the NCAA, which is prepping at this point for the March Madness tournament, it says the tournament's going to be played without fans.
We have some breaking news to get to on the NCAA tournament. We had just seen earlier this week some of the actual dates and the schedules rolled out for where the games would be played, but now we're learning that March Madness basketball games will be closed to public spectators.
They'll end up canceling that tournament altogether the next day. That brings us to about 9 p.m. Eastern Time. President Trump addresses the nation from the Oval Office, only the second time he had done that in his presidency. He bans travel from Europe for 30 days and attempts to soothe investor worries after that day's market crash.
To keep new cases from entering our shores, we will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days.
Now, that address largely seen as a flop. The Dow drops another 2,300 points the next day. And remember, at that point, the day earlier, President Trump said of the virus, quote, "We're prepared, we're doing a great job with it, and it will go away," words that will come to haunt his presidency. Meanwhile, with the president speaking to the country, the NBA all of a sudden cancels the rest of its season effective immediately after Utah Jazz player Rudy Gobert tests positive. That news coming in the middle of the Mavs-Nuggets game. Take a look at Mark Cuban, Mavs owner, reacting in real time to this announcement. Absolutely shocking. Simultaneously, Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson, they're in Australia filming a movie. They post on Instagram that they've both tested positive for this virus, basically becoming our patient zero in a way, the first major American celebrities to contract this virus. And really as good a sign as any at that point that this coronavirus didn't care how rich and famous you were. As long as you were breathing, you were a potential host. And Jill, the rest, as they say, is history. An anxious America goes to bed, unsure what the next days and weeks will bring. We showed you the New York Times A1 from March 11th. Check out the next day's front page. 6-column banner headline taking up the entire front page of that newspaper, basically telling us that we are now in uncharted territory. Now, Jill, we have Baker with us here. The three of us, we were all working that day. I remember how it really feels like it happened yesterday, but at the same time, it could have been 100 years ago, right?
I just want to point out again, like just if you need a visual of how far things have come, you are home right now, Carlo. I'm on floor 25. Baker is on floor 26. We are by ourselves in this studio. And I said on the podcast today, it's kind of like Pompeii in here. Everything stood still basically from, I think it was maybe March, whatever the last day that we were all in the office. Nothing's really changed, at least physically here.
Well, a few things have changed. One, seeing all those clips, I looked a lot younger a year ago than I do right now, which is obviously
I think we all
thing.
did.
Yeah, eye cream really
Younger
has
and skinnier.
Yes, eye cream has really saved me here, guys. But Carlo, you really put that all in chronological order so perfectly in terms of the timeline of how frantic this was. And as we were talking earlier with this doctor earlier in the show, there's so much that none of us knew about this virus at the beginning parts of this stage. We only knew based on the reports that we were getting from China, which was not very much about what was happening in Wuhan. And so this was just an unprecedented time because we had nothing really to compare it to. And here in New York City, this was part of the scary part in all of this. Us living in this city, the virus wreaked havoc here first, more than any other place in the United States. We had the first cases, I think, in California, but it was only a matter of time before it started to spread here in New York City. And it's just incredible how much has happened over the course of the last year, but also how long that year has felt.
It's incredible.
Baker, it also...
go ahead,
Jill.
Carlo, go on.
No, I was just going to say, it's what's also incredible about that, to your point, Baker, is how what we were doing back then, right? I mean, we weren't touching doorknobs, but we were happy to be in conference rooms talking to each other face to face, right? We really didn't understand. It was remarkable how much we didn't really understand how this virus worked. I mean, Jill still makes fun of me to this day because back last February, she was out there buying masks, preparing for this, and I was saying on the podcast, like, what are you doing? Why do you need a mask? They're telling us that masks are useless. So I'll, of course, live that down as Dr. Fauci will as well.
That's what I was going to mention. Not that you didn't, not your role in the masks, but more the advice that we were getting from politicians and from health officials, which was basically go about business as usual. The subway is safe. You don't need to wear masks. I remember at one point Bill de Blasio saying the virus only lives for a few minutes in the air, and nothing against him, right? I just remember it because I was debating if I should go on the subway or not. We've learned a lot. We've come a long way. What always struck me is the moment everyone has things that changed for them. And I remember reading an op-ed that was written by a doctor in Italy, right? So at this point, Wuhan was locked down. The virus was spreading out of control in Europe, and Italy was kind of like ground zero in Europe at that point. And I remember reading a doctor's account where he was saying, we didn't learn from China. You in the United States, please learn from us and what's going on here. And he was describing not having enough ventilators for patients and having to decide who they were going to save, whose life was worth more, a 40-year-old with kids or a 70-year-old with grandkids. I mean, it was just gut-wrenching. And I remember thinking, I can't believe that's going to become our reality soon. And it did become our reality.
I mean, guys, in this city, in New York City, I visually remember tents outside of hospitals and trailers outside of hospitals where they were taking excess patients who had passed away from the virus because they didn't have enough space in the hospitals. And Carlo mentioned Dr. Fauci with the masks. Remember, guys, there was a time where we didn't even know if the cloth masks would be okay for us to wear. Dr. Fauci didn't even know that answer at the time. That's why President Trump continued to hammer away at him when he kept saying that masks don't work. There was a time we didn't know if it was you had to wear the surgical masks, the cloth masks, and all of this. I guess at the end of the day, what we've really learned is if another pandemic happens, we're all hanging out with Jill Wagner because she knows what to do, apparently.
Guys, I hate to say I'm a hoarder, but I still have toilet paper from last year at this time. I said to my husband, I'm like, do we need to order toilet paper? He's like, nah, just go to the garage. We're good. One other thing just that I wanted to note here about the pandemic is that it does feel in a way like we've all gone through this by ourselves, and this is such a difficult story to tell visually because cameras and reporters are not really allowed in hospitals except for if you get exclusive permission to do it. So it's a hard story to tell visually, and it's just a hard story to tell. So unless you know someone who passed away, or you physically got sick, or you're a frontline worker, for the vast majority of Americans, they have been going through this by themselves, socially distanced in their house, and it's a pandemic that hits some people so acutely, right? If you've lost a loved one, or if you're still dealing with long haul symptoms, or if you're sick right now, this feels so incredibly real. I think other people, it hasn't felt like much, right? It's incredible just the difference and the way we all experienced this past
But to
year.
that point, and do you want, the thing I was actually talking about with my husband the other day, think of how many stories in Hollywood, television shows, movies are going to come out about what happened in the year to everybody during the pandemic. So many different historical things happened, and it touched us in so many different ways, Jill. You're going to see the storyline of things that happened in this one year for the foreseeable future in stories for the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
And Jill, I mean,
see the movies and the documentaries already. You could see them being made.
Jill, I was just going to say before we go, we obviously can't forget that, 525 some odd thousand Americans lost their lives in this last year.
Yeah, so true.
If you had thrown that number out a year ago, there's not a person in this country who would have believed it. They were saying 250,000 would be the absolute most. Right. So we just have to remember that, and just in terms of trying to put a positive spin on it, there are a lot of things in our lives that are going to change from this last year. And I think Jill and I are actually planning a special podcast next week to sort of talk about some of those silver linings, the way that the world might change for the better, because all of us have learned, like you guys have been saying, just so much about not just this virus, but about our own way of life, right?
I mean, my waistline reminds me of that every morning, guys.
Baker, I see you occasionally from afar. That is not even true. Baker's sense of humor is still in place. Anyway,
yes, thank God.
Guys, we could reminisce about this forever, really, but just a great look back on the year that was. Carlo, thank you.